Thank you, Scott. And hopefully I don't freeze during this. So I want to talk about something we talked, I think, a couple of years ago about this, but I think it's always worth a revisit, and that's about learning patience, the role of patience in recovery. And I think every addict is probably impatient by nature, but in my work with intensity addicts, which would be the sex and porn addicts and chemsex addicts or amphetamines, there's a special kind of intensity that makes patience even more important in recovery and even more elusive sometimes. So I want to talk about kind of what that's about, and then close with some tips to kind of build patience as we go through our recovery. So when we're in our active addiction with these intensity addictions like sex and porn addiction, the midbrain, which is the part of the addiction where emotions live, where memories live, where trauma lives, and where addiction lives, all those are in the happy same neighborhood in the brain. It's overstimulated, really badly overstimulated, with all the intensity going on, all the dopamine, all the signals for more and more intensity to ramp it up. And that really teaches the brain to sort of forget about patience, because it always wants that instant gratification. And that is a real problem, because over time, not only does the intensity increase, but behaviors become more impulsive as the midbrain kind of takes over, and the braking system for impulses is the frontal cortex. That kind of goes away, that goes to sleep in a way for addiction. And we have a lot of irrational activity. So everything kind of ramps up, everything speeds up in a way that kind of is screaming for addiction, for patience, but it doesn't happen at that point. So this urge for instant gratification that almost every addict experiences, that's what we want. We get that craving, we get the high, the thought crosses our mind. And in the case of these high intensity addictions, we can be doing fine. I've had clients who are doing great, 6 months, no problem, not even thinking about it, and something will happen, right? They'll get a text message from an affair partner or a dealer or an old buddy, or something will happen where it just suddenly is a trigger, and boom, there it is, and they can't wait to kind of go after it, even though they didn't wake up that morning thinking about it. It happened. And so I think learning how to control that, learning how to have some patience with oneself, learning how to resist those impulses is really important. Also, when an intensity addict is not used to having patience, when they don't get the intensity, when they don't get the stimulation, they go into withdrawal. And withdrawal from sex and porn addiction, and there is such a thing, some people don't think there is, but there is such a thing. This is an emotional withdrawal, but it's a lot of irritability, crankiness, blaming, just kind of nasty, ornery kind of behavior that's in recovery. So all of this to say that in recovery, we really need to learn how to slow things down, how to have some patience, because recovery, of course, isn't flicking a switch. It's a long, slow process of often undoing things we've learned, bad habits and bad relations and bad traumas in our life, to recover from that and learn new skills, all of which take a lot of time. So why is patience important, right? There's a couple of tasks that are important here. One is accepting our own shortcomings, to see ourselves clearly. And I think, every addict has denial systems. Every addict has this kind of delusional system that keeps the addiction in place. And when that starts to fall apart or gets torn down, we kind of want to quickly get to the bottom of this and move on. And sometimes that unfolding, the self-discovery process of knowing exactly what are our issues, what am I feeling, what am I thinking, how am I going to handle this, all those skills come at a very slow rate sometimes, and that requires patience as well, including struggles. Most people, by the time they finally do get sober, it's not their first time at the rodeo, and so there's a lot of impatience about this. I've tried this before, it didn't work. Is it work this time? And they're kind of having impatience about the whole process taking, if you will, kind of getting routinized. Also in patience, as we start to realize what we've done as addicts, what has happened, there's this inability to kind of accept that sometimes people are sometimes very hard on themselves. It feeds the negative tapes in one's head. And so having patience and kind of forgiveness with oneself is important. And I think sometimes that not only getting some wisdom about it, but coming to terms with it. This is what I've done. And kind of as we talk about moving from shame to guilt, maybe a more productive way to view things, that also requires patience. So we need patience with ourselves in recovery. And then also finally, in terms of the recovery process, valuable life changes. Recovery requires significant behavioral change in terms of how we view things, how we solve problems, how we see ourselves, how we see our spouse, all those things, how get kind of reevaluated in a way. And that also takes time and requires patience. And we can kind of try to go through this. And I've seen people try to rush this process, go through it fast. And they oftentimes that means skipping over some of the hard work. We see people sort of jumping to conclusions about stuff and not really feeling it or working the way through in a way that's necessary for healing, but just kind of knowing kind of intellectually what the answer should be and kind of mimicking that language and starting to pretend as if. And in that case, I think it doesn't necessarily work. So learning how to do this every day, learning how to put self-awareness, self-control, all the things I've been talking about into effect every day is a really important part of the recovery process. And that before I want to get to the tips, I also want to just say for intensity addicts who lack patience, when we have relaxation time, downtime, or even boredom, kind of open time, that's a very triggering and challenging situation for intensity addicts, because that open space means that some filters are going to start, our feelings are going to start bubbling up, and we're going to start feeling stuff that we may be uncomfortable. And I recommend people having patience with themselves, but actually setting a clock and learning how to practice sitting with uncomfortable feelings. Set a timer for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever you can tolerate, and just sit and be quiet and see what happens. It's pretty intolerable for intensity addicts, but that's like a muscle going to the gym. You can build it up and strengthen that as you go. So patience, that skill that probably most of us never had before recovery, is really, really important for this whole process. And it's important also, and I might add, in terms of just our relationships, right? There's been a lot of damage in our primary relationships, and having some patience with our spouse who has been traumatized, who's been really emotionally abused, probably in many cases, and just really has been has had a lot of pain and emotional pain here. That takes time, and I think a lot of times addicts will get in recovery and feel like in their heart, I've changed. This is different. I'm on the right track, and they may be. But that doesn't mean that the spouse is on the same timetable. And so having patience with people, letting our spouses go through their process as well, go through their healing process, go through their procedures and processes to help them find emotional safety in the relationship. All that takes time. And I think that's, again, where we kind of push, as addicts, we push and want this to happen faster. And I think there's no speeding up that process, really. We can slow it down by making mistakes and doing the wrong thing, but I think it's very hard to speed it up. So how can we build this patience muscle that I've been talking about? One thing is just, I find useful just to kind of be aware of our everyday life as we go through our life. Life will throw us opportunities to require patience. It may be a long line in the grocery store. It may be having to wait for gas. It may be having to wait for something, out there in the world. And just, instead of getting frustrated, instead of getting angry, impatient, try to make it an exercise. And okay, this is a little experiment in learning how to have patience. I can practice breathing. I can do other things to relax, but let's see if I can get through this stuff, getting triggered and triggering myself. Because, by the way, when we get triggered and get agitated, what do we want to do as addicts? We want to self-medicate that, right? So that's a very bad kind of chain reaction that can happen. So I encourage you to take everyday opportunities that require patience to practice and see if you can do that. Waiting in line. All of these strengthen our ability to resist those impulses, right? And remember, I mentioned the impulse control is very much lacking in early recovery. It's something that as the brain comes back online, we gain those skills, but it takes some behavioral practice as well. And being patient with that is one way that's really important. Besides just daily activities, I think a lot of recovery activities provide opportunities for patience as well. One is attending meetings, just the very act of attending meetings and looking around, right? And I think just taking note of where people are at, and again, being gentle with ourselves, but seeing that addiction recovery takes time and takes a lot of work, and it's not something that we can force or speed up. And so I think just take it as an opportunity to remember where you've been, where you're going, take inspiration from people, take lessons from people. But I think patience is all around us when we go to a 12-step meeting, if we take the opportunity to do it. even in our daily activity like exercise. And exercise is a great way to bolster our recovery, right? It's good for our moods. It's good physically. I was talking to the guys at Seeking Integrity today about how exercise can throw off amino acids that rebuild the dopamine transporters that are damaged as part of our addiction. So it helps our brain recover, actually, exercise. There's a danger that we can also overdo it, right? We can become compulsive about it, but exercise is a really good thing. But my point here in terms of patience is let's look at exercise in terms of long-term gain and not term instant gratification, right? So to change our bodies, to get in shape, to lose weight, to build muscle, all that takes time. And I think this is also a great opportunity to look at going to the gym, not so much to look good in the mirror as quickly as we can, but to be building our health over the long term. And looking good, hopefully, will be a side effect of that, a pleasant one. But it's an opportunity, just again, a reframing of our approach to stuff. Instead of expecting instant gratification, really to take our time and to look at even the gym as a healthy practice, as opposed to something that has an outcome that we want right away, weight loss, looking good, and so on. So exercising for stress relief and also those long-term gains is one way of doing it. One of the opportunities we get, I think, in recovery that we probably never had time for or even the interest in was more long-term goals. You know, addiction is very much because of the chaos and the drama that tends to go hand in hand with addiction. I think very often we're practicing crisis management. You know, we're responding to crises. We're trying to put out fires. We're trying to keep other ones from happening. We're dealing with this crisis or that crisis. Just the general unmanageability that happens in the life of a very addict and affects people around an addict, of course. You know, it affects families and loved ones and partners and everything else. But really looking at that in that crisis, it's very hard to see kind of where am I going? What am I doing? What do I want to do? And I think recovery brings the opportunity as the crises calm down and we get more stability to look at maybe long-term goals. I think this is also a place we can exercise patience. You know, so maybe I want to go back to school and finish that degree that I never got. You know, that may take some time. Maybe I'm working, I can only take a class or two at a time. So I think that is also an exercise in patience. Again, learning how to defer goals. I'm reminded of that famous psychology experiment where they put a plate of donuts in a room with 5-year-olds and left the room telling them don't eat any. Like, well, that didn't go so well as you can imagine. And that's kind of how the addict is too. We sell those donuts in front of us, we want it right now. And I think we can't have those donuts. You know, we've given up some of that stuff up. And so we have a chance to rebuild our lives. But that rebuilding takes time. And as does our brain to heal. You know, we're talking in terms of months for the brain healing, and relationship repair can take, you know, months, years. Steph Carnes, as we've talked about here before, it talks about a 5-year window for, you know, relationship recovery, getting it back to the point where, you know, better than it was before, with good communication and real intimacy and all that. But it's a long time. It takes a long time, a lot of healing. There's other things we can do to learn patience. And I think one is turning to regulate our breath. When we get triggered as addicts, oftentimes there's a physiological corresponding sensation that goes with that. Our heartbeat may be quicker. We may feel tension in our stomach or our lungs. We get a lot of physical symptoms that are kind of triggering for us. I think learning how to manage those to calm down the body, like we're trying to calm down the mind, is equally important. And that's where, again, where breathing techniques, I think, are really valuable. Stuff like the 4-7-8 breathing or the grounding techniques, the 5 senses grounding techniques, both of which we've talked about here before. So I think just really being able to calm our bodies down, because when we are in a reactive mode, and most intensity addicts like sex and porn addicts, and chemsex addicts for that matter, with the way they react is what's called a sympathetic arousal. It's an intensity, it's a fight or flight response. So people tend to get agitated and energized, and eyes get big and faces turn red. And that's the kind of sympathetic arousal pattern. They get hot. And so that is another trigger, an internal trigger to move quickly. And that kind of is working against this idea of patience. Breathing techniques are a great way to slow that down and actually increase, and it induces the opposite response, the parasympathetic response, the calming response. So it's a nice way to do that if we're starting to feel really impatient about getting stuff done. And that, by the way, that impatience, and this is a learned habit, can be triggered not just from the intensity to the impatience, which can actually lead to anxiety and even panic. And so we can really do a number on ourselves by going down the rabbit hole of these little intensity triggers if we're not careful. And again, patience is a great alternative to that, a great tool for that, to really keep us calmer. Relaxation techniques. There's a number of them besides breathing. Breathing, I guess, could technically be considered a relaxation technique, but things like the sequential tightening and loosening of different muscle groups, starting with your head, squeezing the forehead, tensing it up, tensing your eyes, tensing your cheeks, your jaw, and then relaxing, and your shoulders, your arms, your hands, and so on, just progressively down from the top of your body to the bottom, just clenching and tightening up each muscle group and then relaxing. That's a great way to kind of regain control over your body, which has a mind of its own, but you're consciously and intentionally focusing on these different muscle groups, taking control back by flexing it and then releasing it. And it's a great way to kind of reestablish a sense of equilibrium in your body when it's kind of out of balance sometimes. And then finally, if everything else fails, the standard that I always fall back on is the serenity prayer. If there's things that I'm feeling impatient about, if there's feelings that I'm feeling anxious about, I go back to that, because there's just huge wisdom there in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what is it about this situation that I actually have any control over? What don't I have any control over? And then the third part of this waiver is helping us see that difference, right? And I think that really is a wonderful guide, because when we're kind of in addictive reactive mode, it's more of a shotgun blast, just like shoot at everything, as opposed to a kind of a targeted approach about what do I have control over? What can actually change versus not? And so I think the serenity prayer has huge wisdom. So all of this is just a nice general reminder that we are, as addicts, and probably people that are married to addicts, in this dance of drama and chaos and intensity and speed. And if we can just slow it and not work against ourselves by really strengthening our ability to practice patience, will do us all a great favor. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. As you can probably have figured out if you got here late, our topic is the role of patience in recovery. Type your questions into the Q&A about patience or about anything else to do with addiction and recovery. We'll be happy to answer any and all questions. And I've got a couple to get us rolling here. So you suggested setting a timer for 5 minutes and seeing how long you can tolerate, being bored or other forms of emotional discomfort. What if I drift into fantasy to cope with that? What do I do? Because, hey, I'm a sex addict, a long sober sex addict, but I still struggle to sit more than a few minutes without my head wandering. What can I do if my head wanders while I'm trying to tolerate boredom or whatever?
It's a great question, Scott. And you're right. We have a tendency to do that when we're bored or when we're uncomfortable or any of the above, right? First of all, I think it's really important. This is an essential skill for every addict, is to know or to identify when they're going into fantasy or when they're disconnecting or dissociating. And this is something where, when, just to back up a minute, every sex addict and porn addict, that's the bubble we talk about. We step into that fantasy world, out of our lives, into this kind of pain-free world we have total control over, and no vulnerability, no emotion, no feelings really, at least uncomfortable feelings. So we really need to know when we're doing that. And most addicts will go into that automatically without even knowing it. So oftentimes at Seeking Integrity, for example, one of the kind of skills we see, if we see guys in group, for example, kind of checked out, we'll point it out and ask them to, and it's a skill also that you can start to learn and identify, when am I going in there? And so two kind of subsets of skills, I guess. One is, if you're in there, knowing how to get yourself out. But second, most important maybe, is knowing when you're in the first place and what that feels like, and so you can prevent yourself from going in there. So the awareness of it is really important. I think part of the setup of this little exercise would be the intention of, if I go into fantasy, that's the end of the experiment, right? Because that means that that's the limit of my tolerance for being able to sit with that without without being triggered somehow. And so I think that and thank you for pointing that out, because that's probably the likely scenario. It's not that
It's just like, I know me, I know what I would do.
yeah. So I think just going in with the acknowledgement that if I find myself in fantasy, then game's over. Got to click the timer and do some breathing and maybe start over or not. But yeah, that's a really important one, because that's the go-to place, right, for a lot of fantasy in sex acts.
Yeah, and I mean, when we teach about the cycle of addiction, there's the trigger like boredom, and then we automatically slide forward into fantasy. That's the next stage of the cycle. And 9 times out of 10, we're not even aware that we've done it. And so, guys have to, and women, if you're sex addicts have to learn to recognize, oh my God, I'm in fantasy, and then do something about it. I personally find the best intervention is usually the 3-second rule, which is, second number 1, recognize, oh, I'm in a sexual fantasy. Second number 2, turn away from it. And then in second number 3, if I'm, fantasizing about someone or something specific, humanize that person, give them, real reason for being here. It's hard to objectify someone we see as a real person. So we humanize them, or just think about something else. Some of my guys will say, change the channel. And that seems to work really well. Just, think about the score of last night's game, or, the Reds are on an 11-game winning streak. Yay, Reds. Go Red. That's actually an actual fact. Anyway, I'm a big Reds fan and they're winning. It's been a long time. Pardon me for gloating. But I find the 3-second rule works really well. All of the other things, breath work helps. Anything to get out of it. But be aware, if you're the addict, that's probably where your head's going to go if you're bored, or you have unstructured free time, or you're feeling lonely, or whatever. That it's just an automatic coping mechanism. So we need to recognize the emotional trigger. And we also need to be able to recognize, oh, I have slid forward in the cycle a little bit in fantasy.
Right. Exactly.
So I think that's really important. Type some questions in for us. We've only got one in there. I've got a couple more here, so we can keep going for a while. But otherwise, it's going to be a very short session tonight. I just wanted to point out the impatience I see from addicts and from betrayed partners tends to center around 2 things. One of them is, why can't I trust him yet? That's the partner, and the converse is, why won't she trust me yet? That's the addict. We both want to get to trust, but it takes time. We need patience. And the other one is, addicts will say, why am I not well yet? Why do I still have to use all these tools? Why is this still so hard? And betrayed partners want to know, why isn't he well yet? Why does he have to use all those tools? Why is he still telling me lies, and things like that? Recovery it's a marathon, not a sprint. I know there's no set time frame for when addicts, when the lust of the mind drains away. How long does that take? And how long does it take for trust to reemerge? I know there's no set time frame, but can you talk a little bit about both of those in terms of what to look for to know if they're happening?
Yeah, I think you're right, of course, that trust takes a while, and it's variable. There's no magic number where one size fits all. But I think there's some things we can watch for in the development of that. And that one, I think, is transparency and integrity on the part of the addict, right? Sharing what's going on. And we've talked about that in this webinar before. If there's a problem, if there's an issue, we recommend the addict talk to their sponsor first, their peers. They deal with it. They correct the situation, whatever that is, and then go back and report the entire thing to the spouse, and fast, right, within 24 hours latest. And what that does, though, instead of just potentially triggering the spouse saying, I'm having this or I did that, they can say, yeah, I'm having this and I had that, and this is what I did about it. And believe it or not, although that may be troubling, what we hear from spouses is that what's more troubling is that if there's some lie about the behavior, if there was covering up, or people weren't truthful about it, because it will come out eventually. It always does. And so just having that transparency, I think, helps the spouse gain confidence in the process. And I think those kind of little building blocks help kind of contribute to this growing, slowly growing kind of body of evidence that there's some change happening. So the transparency, I think good communication, I think living integrity, and by that I mean, doing what you say you're going to do, and being transparent in all of that. All of these little actions that I know feel kind of geologically slow sometimes because they're just living your life with integrity on a daily basis, and that can take time to rebuild because the traumatic aspects of a betrayed partner are very well documented and very real, and those things take time. There's many factors that can slow it down, right, or affect it. One is that both, usually the addict and the partner, have their own issues, right? Maybe there's trauma that was there before. Maybe there's other stuff besides just the sex addiction or porn addiction in the marriage, and so, or maybe the person's been betrayed before, and this betrayal just brings it all up again. So those kind of factors can, lengthen or shorten depending on how it works out, the process as well. So I think that's important. I think addicts have to remember that the level of betrayal has been really high, and we need to really respect that and honor that, and let people have their own process, because there's no timetable on this. We always talk about the roller coasters that both the addict and the partner are on, and they're on different roller coasters. So one may be up, one may be down, and that can go on for quite a while. And so again, patience required. But I think just the basic kind of common sense items of transparency, integrity, good communication, and kind of just living like an open book as best you can, I think is the way to go. And that causes this healing. Now, there's so many things that can set it back, right? Little relapse, we've seen sometimes people that are going through the motions of recovery, but haven't really, I think, internalized or accepted it. And so many times people use the expression checking the boxes, right? I'm checking the boxes on this, but they're not really feeling it, not really doing the inner work. And I think that can really slow it down. It looks maybe like they're doing all the right stuff, but they're blaming, they're angry, they're irritable. There's a lot of signs and symptoms that they're not quite doing all the work they need to do. And that can slow it down too. So a lot of factors that can kind of keep it on track, and a lot of factors that can push it off the track too. But I think just understanding people have an idea of what they bring to the table in terms of their own history, and if it's a more complicated history with trauma or other kinds of betrayal, abandonment kind of stuff, then it may last longer than one would hope. This recovery process doesn't mean it's going to stop or stall or not be possible, but it may take longer.
Okay, thank you. One of the risk factors for addiction is what we call impulsivity. And I think there are studies that show impulsivity is genetic. So some of addictive risk factors are genetic, which we already knew. Mostly it's trauma-based, but can you talk a little bit about the link between impulsivity and patience and addiction? I'm thinking about the marshmallow study with kids, and then the follow-up like 20 years later, the ones who were. I think the study was you can have one marshmallow now or two marshmallows in an hour. And if they gobbled the marshmallow right away, they were impulsive. If they waited an hour to get two marshmallows, they were not. And the impulsive kids, like 20 years later, had a much higher rate of addiction. Is that linked to this whole intensity addiction stuff we're talking about?
I think, yeah, very much so. You can draw, if not a straight line, a pretty direct line between those two things. There is this genetic component you just described. I'm thinking about sensations, what we call sensation seekers, right? And most intensity addicts have that kind of sensation-seeking personality. They are the ones that need experience, that need get their heart racing. These are the guys that do bungee jumping and parachuting and rock climbing and dangerous skiing and all that stuff to get the blood going. And I think that kind of intensity mimics a lot of the acting out behaviors as well, in terms of physiological response anyway. So there's this kind of underlying genetic foundation for it, but there's also a more direct link. When I spoke about addiction kind of being in the midbrain, where emotion and memories and trauma all kind of congregate, that's where the addiction messages spring from. And with sex and porn addiction, they're very much like go messages, go, 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 and do it, act out, with this great the impulse itself is quite intense. And normally in our brain, the way it's designed, it would be that there'd be some counterbalance to that in terms of impulse control. So you'd have the message, go do it, do it, but then there'd be usually the smarter part of our brain, the adult in the room, the wise one, which happens to be the prefrontal cortex, not the midbrain where the addiction is. So two different parts of the brain. The adult in the room, the prefrontal cortex, is where the impulse control messages come from, and that usually is enough to temper, in a normal person, temper the impulse. For example, I might have an impulse to act out, and then if I were sort of not an addict, my prefrontal cortex might say, well, last time you did this or that behavior, it didn't work out so well. You had bad consequences. You felt terrible. You hurt people you love, and all that kind of rational stuff that normally you'd think be enough to control it. And by the way, this is the complaint of a lot of partners too. If you really cared about me, if you really thought this was important, you wouldn't do that. And that's very logical. But when you're in the middle of the addiction, those messages coming out of the midbrain saying, go, do it, it's extremely strong, and there's no pushback. There's no braking system to stop it. And so I think that's, again, and that happens with addiction, those two parts of the brain get kind of disconnected. In recovery, they start to heal again. And the pathways between the two parts get strengthened. But I think, so it's kind of a brain mechanical issue too, that we lose our braking system basically when we're in the heat of addiction, just when we need it most, frankly. And you overlay that on top of this kind of sensation-seeking personality, and you can get some explosive combinations there, not good results.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump to the Q&A here. So we have one question in the Q&A, which I'm going to turn into two, but type some more in there for us. It is, can you speak to any connections between patience, impatience, and willingness in the addict? So I'm going to turn it into two questions. Number one, can you talk about what willingness is and why it's so darn important? And then maybe related to patience and impatience.
Yeah, so of course, willingness is a foundational principle of recovery, an essential piece, not only to get started in the recovery process, but to maintain it overall. And that willingness is that it's a break right in our denial system, our defenses and our walls that keep us kind of locked in place, keep the addiction locked in place, and keep us kind of trapped behind the walls inside it. That this whole system of kind of skewed beliefs that justify and rationalize our behavior. Willingness really is this crack in that defense. We can start to see the role that we might be playing in this. We might see our own part of this, that it's not the fault of everybody around us, or particularly our spouse or job or life circumstances or whatever, but that we have a role in this. And more important, it's up to us to fix it in ourselves. And I think that willingness to be able to accept that behavior, accept the idea that, yeah, maybe it is me, maybe this isn't not everybody else's fault, maybe I need to do something, and being willing to actually follow through and to do it, and not to minimize the pain that one feels, right, giving up one's addiction, because they're very powerful coping mechanisms and medication for all the pain that we feel in our lives. And so it's, in a way, we're giving up our armor. And so to step out of that takes some willingness, and I would say some courage too. Just like I believe it takes a lot of courage to come to treatment, because you don't know what to expect. You're giving up control, and that's really what willingness in recovery from addiction means too. We're giving up control and willing to do what we think we need to do. We're willing to do what other people say we need to do, even if it doesn't quite make sense to us, because we're willing to see that we don't necessarily have all the answers, right? And that we are actually part of the problem. And so that is a huge shift. And I found that that willingness usually comes with a little bit of pain. So we often see people are most willing at the end of the addiction cycle when they're in that shame and remorse. They've acted out again, they've relapsed again, they've caused problems again, and now they're feeling terrible about it. And that lasts for a while, but we all know that's a temporary state, right? Until we start to feel better, till our bodies get better, or till we feel sexually aroused again, or we have another argument, or whatever triggers there might be out there. That's a temporary state. But I think it's also the most important state where we can grab an addict and maybe help them. They're teachable in those moments, and that teachability really translates into willingness to do the right thing, in my mind. So willingness, I think, is directly related then to patience, right? We've been talking about patience tonight as this skill that allows us to go through a recovery process, which by definition is long and slow, and it's sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's frustrating and it's emotionally painful because we have to deal with stuff that we've been just kicking down the road ahead of us for years, or we've just never even felt before. We've been totally numb to it, or we've blocked it out totally. And so it's kind of waking up to our past, waking up to feelings, waking up to all kinds of sensations and triggers, and being able to deal with that. And there are some beautiful big book quotes that I won't even try to quote them now, but it describes this process of the essential change, right? The psychic change that we have to go through in recovery. We're kind of rebuilding and rewiring, it's a total reno, and that takes time and patience. And I think we want to kind of jump ahead, we want to move ahead, we get frustrated. One thing about addicts, we're easily frustrated. And so if I have a setback, or things don't go my way, or if things are a little bit hard to grasp, or I'm not seeing it and everybody else seems to be getting it, these are all frustrating moments that really trigger my impatience. And so again, the being willing to sit with the discomfort, being willing to go through what we need to be willing to do to get to move into recovery, all of it directly requires that skill to be able to go with what can seem like at least a very slow process of unfolding and revealing and not understanding, and just being patient even with that. I remember in my own recovery, I just couldn't understand why they were a certain way, or what was going on, or why I was reacting. And eventually the answers came, but they didn't come in my time frame. They came with experience and time, and sometimes years later I got answers that I've been desperately wanting earlier on. So it's a slow process that unfolds. And I think if we can embrace the patience around that, it's quite a beautiful process to kind of witness and take it in the scale that it's meant to be experienced on. It can be that reawakening can be a really exciting time as well. But I think we have to be able to get into the right tempo, and that requires patience, right? It's not a fast game. It's like you said, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and we have to adapt to that tempo.
Yeah. Okay, next question here. Addicts are taught early on that dissing the betrayed partner is bad because we're the ones who made them crazy. Betrayed partner groups, I am told, bash their addicts quite regularly and extensively. Considering brain plasticity and healing, doesn't bashing slow down the healing process? Is the treatment model broken? David, do you mind if I address this one first?
Go ahead.
Okay. So addicts are taught early on that dissing the betrayed partner is bad because we made them crazy. First of all, we did not make them crazy. We pushed them into a relational crisis. And crisis makes people behave in ways that look and even seem crazy. That doesn't mean they're crazy. It means they're in crisis. So we didn't make them crazy. We put them in crisis. And they may look crazy when they're in crisis. And no crisis is more crazy making, so to speak, than a relational crisis. The person we love has hurt us and we don't know what the future this is very scary. It is a tremendous crisis. And people in crisis just, the brain doesn't work logically all the time in the middle of a crisis. So I wanted to address that. Betrayed partner groups, I'm told, bash their addicts quite regularly and extensively. Considering brain plasticity and healing, doesn't bashing slow down the healing process? I'm going to leave that to David. Is the treatment model broken? So betrayed partner groups do not, the ones that I sit in on, and I do sit in on them once in a while, are not very bashing. You know, they tell what they're going through, but they're not really typically bashing the addicts. Once in a while, they get like that. I think the codependence model encourages that. The codependence model of dealing with betrayed partners tells betrayed partners there's something wrong with them, that they're partnered with this horrible person. I think that treatment model is absolutely 100% broken. And I much prefer the prodependence model that we espouse at Seeking Integrity. Dr. Rob Weiss, our founder, also founded the prodependence movement. It says it celebrates a betrayed partner's desire to stay with a troubled person and to help a troubled person, instead of saying, oh, you're reenacting your own trauma, and if you don't deal with your own trauma, nothing's going to change and the addict won't get better. It almost blames them for what the addict does. I think that model is broken. And one of the reasons the groups that I sit in on tend to be less bashy is they tend to be very prodependence oriented, which is, I love my partner and I want to help him. How can I do it better? That's the approach prodependence takes. The approach codependence take is, my partner's an asshole and I need to detach with love. And that leads to bashing. So, and anyway, that's my little rant on prodependence versus codependence. And I do truly believe the codependence model is a broken model. It didn't start out that way. It's not what the progenitors intended. It's what it has become over time. And it is time to switch to prodependence. Anything you want to add to that, David? And please address brain plasticity and healing. That's way more your area than mine.
Yeah, I like what you said. I'll just add, I think there are some groups out there that tend to be more negative than others. And I think partners can come away kind of more agitated and revved up than, I don't think that's necessarily helpful. So I think just being, and like any group, right? Any group, they have different flavors and certain meetings are run different ways. So I'd just be, those groups, I think that maybe this was referring to, they're out there. There are not many of them, but I think I much prefer the model that Scott just mentioned, the prodependence model that talks about really just a more healthy, loving solution to this problem.
And David, you and I were literally just discussing, these problematic betrayed partners groups, because they do exist. And there's also at least one person I know who has a treatment process, and we discussed this yesterday. What we named that is more hurtful than helpful.
Right.
So how does a betrayed partner know which groups are helping, which aren't?
Great question. I think kind of one's gut, first of all, just if it feels, if the overall balance of the conversation is more solution focused, more healing focused, as opposed to blaming or encouraging people to feel like victims, or and not to say that abuse partners are not in some way, in some sense, victims, then of course they are, but in terms of abusive, and certainly, again, some relationships are abusive, but I think there's a toxic level of certain groups. I would encourage people just take balance of the positive versus the negative kinds of comments on it. And I think that, and how do you feel when you leave? Are you angry when you finish the group? Are you feeling good? Are you feeling stressed? Or are you feeling like there's some hope and there's some solution out there? And so I think just it's a, not every group is meant for every person or right for every person, but I think
Yeah.
There are those that I think are unfortunate because I think they slow down the recovery process. And with that, I'll just say, I don't know there's a direct line between brain plasticity and bashing and healing. I think, brain plasticity, of course, our brains adapt to the addiction, they adapt to everything. The way we live our lives affect it. So I'm not sure brain plasticity plays a role here, but I would say that bashing in general, whether it's of the partner or of the addict, is probably not a very beneficial strategy because it just gets everybody revved up. We get a lot of anger, we get a lot of blaming. And in my experience as a therapist, just when we start looking at a problem from the point of view of blaming and anger and feeling like we're the victims in this, that's not necessarily a way out into some healthy solution. So I think it's just a matter of, and I'm not trying to be, to say we should all be Pollyanna about it. Harmful things happen in these dynamics, but I think the solution and the healing really has to be kind of grounded in a more kind of positive, hopeful message and strategy. And just in my experience, and we've talked about this here, Scott, from the point of view of the addict, the addict that stays angry. We can have people in meetings for 20 years. And if they don't really do the work on themselves, they're just angry. And anger is not a happy place that any of us want to spend much time in. So, I don't think bashing is ever useful in any way on either side, partner or addict. I don't think many good things coming from it.
Yeah. And by the way, this advice is good for addicts as well as betrayed partners. The 12-step room that I go to has about 30 meetings a week. And there's about 5 or 6 of them that I literally don't go to because the people who attend that meeting on a regular basis are what I call living in the problem. The rest of the meetings are all about the solution. I want to go to a meeting where people are talking about the solution. I know what the problem is.
Right.
I need a solution. So whether you're an addict or a betrayed partner, look for meetings that focus, as David mentioned, on the solution. Look for some hope. Look for some people who have gotten better. Follow their lead, definitely. And I think that's just good advice for anything, really. But yeah.
Yeah, and when we see anger, that'll resonate with our own anger, right? We can be drawn to that. We can be drawn to sarcasm. We can be drawn to that stuff. It maybe feels good in the short term, but I guarantee in the long term, it is not a good feeling, and it's not healthy or helpful for the relationship either.
Yeah. Okay. Next one here. This is a great question from a recovering sex addict, who says, my wife recently disclosed an affair that she had over 20 years ago. What resources would you recommend for betrayal trauma recovery, specifically as it applies to someone who has also betrayed, AKA me, the sex addict? I think that's a great question because this happens more often than a lot of people realize, I think.
Yeah. It is an interesting question. And I think one we don't talk about enough because I've heard this with some frequency. I think the same resources that we recommend for betrayed partners, the same feelings are going to emerge, right? Even though maybe to a lesser extent if it's 20 years ago, but still the fact occurs that there was some betrayal, there was some dishonesty, probably some manipulation, some lack of transparency, and all of that can cause a reaction in us. And I think where a recovering addict is perhaps more vulnerable to this kind of thing is that it can create a sense of anger and almost, I think an addict could take that and run with it. We kind of justify some bad behavior or an attitude, or I think it just opens up a can of worms. So I think I would nip any of that in the bud as fast as you can and process any reaction you have. And I'm not saying don't have a reaction. The reaction would be normal, and it's probably healthy to have the reaction, right? To feel angry and betrayed and like, what the heck, and all that. But talk about them, right? Because what a great excuse to relapse. If you take this and run in that direction with this discovery, right? Because again, we can talk ourselves into anything, and this is fuel. So I would deal with it. I'd be honest with it. Everything we expect the addict to do when the situation is reversed is that to try to live in integrity, to talk about it, and to be honest with it, and to see what the feelings are. 20 years is a long time ago. Not that isn't relevant, but I think we also have to kind of put things in perspective sometimes and see how the relationship has been in those 20 years since, and what the communication has been like, and so on. So yeah, I mean, this is an issue, and I thank you for bringing it up, because it does happen. But I think I don't think there's any special set of resources or materials in this situation. I guess the same good materials we have for betrayed partners would be applicable here. It's just another set of reading stuff to do.
Yeah, and I like what you said about using it as an excuse to relapse, because in the work groups, or whether I'm at the treatment center. By the way, guys, I'll be there tomorrow. Hi. For the guys at our treatment center, they're all with us today. I hear a lot of times, yeah, but she, and I'm like, yeah, shut up. We're not talking about her right now. We're talking about you. This is your addiction recovery. And the point that I never follow up with is, if you're a betrayed partner as well, that's a different form of recovery that also needs to happen. Do you see, like, this needs to be sort of two separate healing processes, or do they intertwine? I mean, what do you think?
I think they totally intertwine, and I think actually you could have some useful discussions with this, right? Because when we talk about the development of empathy and compassion, which is a big challenge for a lot of recovering sex addicts, here's an opportunity to relate feelings and how it feels, and to talk about that and process it. And I think it could be a little bit of a window into the feelings of the betrayed partner, given the current sex addiction situation. If this things in reverse is revealed, you can talk about that. I think each is maybe more relatable to the other. And so I think it can actually be a good thing to talk about for healing.
Yeah. I love this last one here. What about sex addicts who want to share their partner, which I assume they're talking about? They want to have like a swinger relationship, or an open relationship, or a cuckolding relationship, or something. What do we say when sex addicts want to do that?
Well, that's a big red flag, to put it nicely. I think,
I mean, for starters, it's kind of up to the betrayed partner whether they want to be involved in that.
There is that. It sounds like kind of, sharing, right? So this is something for discussion, right? I think, and we have this sometimes with our gay clients who, in the gay community, I think sometimes there's more flexibility or agreements or discussion about more open kinds of things. And the key to that seems to be communication. But even with the best communication in the world, I think it just opens the door to all kinds of potential pitfalls and jealousies and arguments and issues. I think, I'm an alcoholic in recovery. I think for me, it'd be kind of like maybe saying beer was okay and hard liquor wasn't. I think to open up and share partners for sex addicts is just, I don't know how that can be done, frankly, in a way that protects sobriety and integrity. It's just way too risky in my book.
Yeah, it's seeking integrity. We don't place value judgments on any, mutually consensual adult sexual behaviors. I mean, if you and your wife are okay with swinging and you're both on board with that, cool, okay, great. I'm not going to place a value judgment on it. Not for me, thank you, but if it's working for the two of you, great. I find that most of the time it's working for one, but not the other. That's a whole different story. Usually one person feels coerced into doing it. Again, that's a different story. But if you're truly mutually in agreement on something like this, not not a huge problem. But for a sex addict, you know, probably a behavior that needs to be kiboshed a little bit. I mean, sex addicts can stay sober and have their kinks and that kind of stuff. It needs a lot of discussion if this is going to happen for a sex addict, that, you know, the sponsor, the therapist, the partner all need to be involved in a very open and honest and frank discussion about what's going to work and what's not going to work. And, you know, I think David's point earlier was this is the kind of thing that'll drag you out into all the other behaviors, even if this one's okay. I run into this with pornography a lot. My wife has no problem with me looking at porn. Yeah, but you're doing it 6 hours a day and you injured your penis masturbating. It doesn't matter if your wife has a problem. You have a problem and you need to stop. And I think that's the point you were making. Like, you're a sex addict. Let's reel it in a little bit.
Right. And very, at least in my experience, a lot of times these arrangements are made in the midst of an active addiction. And so how that looks in recovery may be very different. Not that it can't happen, but the dynamics are going to be very different. And so it's kind of you have to start from scratch on those negotiations, I think, in recovery.
Sorry, I meant, do they feel betrayed too? So does the sex addict who wants to share their partner feel betrayed? Well, I don't know. Why would you want to share your partner if you're going to feel betrayed? Anyway, thoughts, David?
I
mean, that's what I'm reading.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we're out of time. So thank you, everybody, for the questions. Great topic today, David. And we will be back next week, same time, same place. So please come, bring a friend, and we will see you then. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just remember, patience is a real integral part of recovery, and it's a skill, and it's a slow learning skill. Be patient. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks.